The first time I heard the broadcast, I thought someone had finally pranked the overnight shift. That's the honest version. The useful version is that I didn't believe what I was hearing for almost 4 minutes, which means for almost 4 minutes a dead man was still alive in my head, while his obituary read itself into my headphones. My name is Wyatt Keller. I'm the overnight engineer at KBRN 1290 AM, a one-tower station wedged between a feed store and a shuttered tire shop in a town in southern Missouri that you would not recognize by name. My job, stripped of flattery, is to keep a dying signal upright until sunrise. I change the transmitter filters. I log the carrier readings. I babysit a syndicated feed of coast-to-coast callers who believe the moon is hollow. Between the hours of midnight and 5, I am the only person in the building, and usually the only person listening. That night, a Tuesday, early April, the kind of cold that still bites after dark, I was running a routine carrier check. You put a receiver on the station's own output, confirm modulation, confirm there's no spurious bleed from the tower, then log it and forget it. Dead air on the monitor between syndicated segments is normal. What is not normal is a voice coming through the dead air. It was a man, older, flat delivery. He said, KBRN News at the top of the hour, Sunday, April 7th. Our lead story this morning. Hollister resident Daryl Mabry, age 62, was pronounced dead late last night after a single vehicle accident on Route Z near the Ozark County line. Mabry, a longtime employee of the County Roads Department, is survived by his wife Linda and 2 adult children. Then the voice moved on. Weather, a school lunch menu, a reminder about the volunteer fire department pancake breakfast. I sat there with my hand on the board and did nothing. Nothing is the correct word. I didn't write it down, I didn't call anyone, I didn't even turn my head, because it was Tuesday, April 2nd. Sunday was 5 days away. Daryl Mabry was not dead. I knew Daryl Mabry. He had come by the station 2 winters ago to complain about our signal bleeding into his truck radio, and he had stood in this same room and called me son in a way that wasn't unkind. The bulletin ran 1 minute and 40 seconds. When it ended, the dead air came back clean, and the syndicated feed reconnected at the top of the hour like nothing had happened. I rewound the logger. That's the part I keep going back to. The logger is a separate system. It records every second of our output on a rolling 7-day buffer. I scrubbed to the timecode. The bulletin was there, time-stamped, verifiable, recorded in my own station's voice against my own station's carrier, reading news from Sunday on a Tuesday night. I sat at the board for a long time with my headphones half off. I remember being aware of my own breathing, the way you become aware of it in a medical waiting room. I kept thinking someone would walk in and explain. No one did. It was 2:14 a.m. and the building was empty, and the voice I had just heard did not belong to anyone I employed. I didn't call Daryl. I didn't call anyone. I wrote anomalous bleed, investigate, in the night log, in handwriting that looked like someone else's, and I finished my shift. That was the first mistake. Writing it down like a technical problem, pretending it could be filed. By the time I got home, the sun was a bruise above the grain elevators, and I was running the bulletin back in my head word for word. I live alone in a rented half of a duplex on the east side of town, next to a woman named Corinne who teaches 5th grade and who does not like my hours. I nodded at her on the porch, and she said something about my face that I didn't catch. I slept 4 hours. I dreamed about my father's funeral, which is a dream I have when I'm about to do something I will regret. I woke up and drove straight back to the station. The day guy, Perry, was on the air doing the farm report. Perry is 68, a retired ag teacher, and he treats the microphone like a rifle he has been told to hold, but not aim. He raised his eyebrows at me through the studio glass. I waved him off and went back to the engineering room and closed the door. I pulled the logger file onto a thumb drive. I played it on my laptop with headphones. Same bulletin, same voice, same timestamp. Daryl Mabry, dead on Sunday, April 7th, announced on Tuesday, April 2nd. I tried to tell myself about every possibility a sane engineer would consider. A pirate transmitter on a nearby frequency could bleed into our carrier if someone knew what they were doing. A syndicated error could have pushed a wrong file. Someone could be in the building at night, recording over my output for a joke, for a podcast, for a reason I couldn't imagine. None of it fit. The voice wasn't Perry. It wasn't the weekend guy, Leland. It wasn't any of the automated voice talent we license. It read copy we don't write. We don't do local obituaries on KBRN. We haven't since before I got here. And the timestamp was on our own machine, on a buffer no one else has access to. I pulled up the county sheriff's scanner feed on my phone. I told myself I would listen for an hour. If nothing was said about Daryl Mabry, I would go home. At 11:47 a.m., a deputy requested a welfare check on the west end of town. Unrelated. At 12:20, an ambulance ran to a slip and fall at the Casey's. Unrelated. At 1:13, I heard the words Route Z, and my stomach dropped before the rest of the sentence arrived. It wasn't Daryl. It was a deer carcass in the roadway. The deputy wanted it moved before someone hit it. I laughed out loud, alone in the engineering room, and the laugh came out of me the way a cough comes out of someone who's been sick longer than they admitted. I didn't call Daryl. That's the thing I want on record. I thought about it. I had his number on a sticky note from the signal bleed complaint. I picked up my cell phone and put it down 3 times. What was I going to say? Mr. Mabry, this is the kid from the radio station. I need you to stay off Route Z for the next 5 days because a voice that isn't mine said you'd be dead by Sunday. He would hang up. He would call the station manager. I would lose the only job in this town that lets me work at night and disappear during the day. So, I did what I do. I filed it. I went home. I waited for the next shift. I keep saying I waited. The truer word is that I rehearsed. Wednesday night I got to the station at 11:45, 15 minutes early, which I never do. Perry looked at me like I had grown a second head and handed off the board without comment. The syndicated feed spun up. I sat down and put the headphones on, and I didn't do the carrier check. I just listened to our own output, raw, for an hour, waiting for the dead air between segments. At 1:02 a.m., it came. Same flat, older voice. No preamble. KBRN News at the top of the hour. Saturday, April 6th. A Branson woman, Patricia Vanover, age 49, was killed late Friday evening in what sheriff's deputies are describing as a domestic incident at her residence on Oak Grove Road. Her husband is in custody pending charges. No other injuries were reported. Then weather. Then a reminder that the library book sale was moved to Tuesday. The bulletin was 22 seconds shorter than the one the night before. I noticed that before I noticed anything else, which tells you something about who I am. Saturday was 4 days away. The first bulletin had been 5 days out. The gap was closing. I pulled up the logger, time-stamped, recorded, real. I did not know Patricia Vanover. I wrote her name on a legal pad. I wrote Daryl Mabry above it. I drew a line between them that didn't mean anything except that I had started a list. At 3:14 a.m., the syndicated feed cut for a local insert, and the voice came back. Not a bulletin this time. Just one line, clean, almost gentle. KBRN reminds listeners that the pancake breakfast at the Hollister Volunteer Fire Department has been cancelled this Sunday due to a death in the department family. Then the feed resumed. Coast to coast. A caller in Nevada explaining tectonic plates. I sat at the board, and I understood something I did not want to understand. The broadcast wasn't one bulletin. It was an entire future program. It was reading itself forward, node by node, through the dead space in my own transmission, on a schedule that belonged to a week I had not lived yet. And it knew the order. I typed Daryl Mabry and Patricia Vanover into a county obituaries search on my laptop. Nothing. I typed them into a sheriff's incident log. Nothing. I closed the laptop and opened it again, because that's what a person does when they want the machine to change its mind. At 4:30 a.m., I did something I have never done on a shift. I went out to my truck and I sat with the engine off, and I called my sister in Tulsa. She didn't pick up. I left a message that said only, "Hey, it's me. Nothing's wrong. Call me when you can." I listened to the message back in my own voicemail system before I sent it, because I wanted to be sure my voice still sounded like my voice. It did, but I wasn't sure that meant what I wanted it to mean anymore. When I got home that morning, Corinne was out on her porch with coffee. She looked at me and said, "You okay, Wyatt?" And I said, "Long night." And she said, "You said that yesterday." And I went inside and closed the door without answering. I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed with the legal pad on my knees, and I waited for Saturday to prove me wrong. Patricia Vanover died on Friday night. I heard about it Saturday morning on a competitor's station while I was making coffee, because I couldn't bring myself to turn on KBRN. The anchor said domestic incident, in the same careful voice anchors always use. Oak Grove Road, husband in custody. No other injuries. I set the coffee down. I didn't pick it up again. Daryl Mabry was still alive. That's what I kept telling myself. The first bulletin had said Sunday. It was only Saturday. There was still a day. There was still a window. I drove out to Route Z that afternoon. I don't know what I thought I was going to do. Stand in the road, wave him off. I drove the entire corridor between Hollister and the Ozark County line at 20 under the limit, and I did not see Daryl's truck, and I did not see anything that looked like the shape of an accident waiting to happen. Just April fields, a turkey vulture on a fence post, a closed-down barbecue stand with a hand-painted sign. I almost turned around and drove to his house. I had the address. I had rehearsed the sentence. "Mr. Mabry, I know how this sounds. Please just stay home tomorrow." I had rehearsed his response in two. The phone call to the station manager, the words, "mentally unwell," the slow professional end of the only life I had built. I drove home instead. That night I worked the shift. I didn't do the carrier check because I already knew. At 1:02 a.m., the dead air came in and the voice read Sunday's obituary for Daryl Mabry, identical to the one I had heard on Tuesday, as if the signal wanted me to confirm my own failure in advance. It added one line this time. "Mabry is the second of the week." I took my headphones off and I walked out of the engineering room, and I stood in the parking lot in my jacket with the cold coming up through the asphalt into my legs. The tower blinked above me, red and patient. I thought about climbing it. Not to jump, just to be higher than the signal for a minute. I didn't climb it. I went back inside. I finished the shift. I logged the carrier readings. I wrote nothing about the bulletin in the night log, because the night log was a thing other people read, and I understood now that the bulletins were not for other people. Sunday evening, a little after 6, my phone buzzed with a news alert from the local paper's website. Single vehicle accident. Route Z. 1 fatality. Driver identified as Daryl Mabry, 62 of Hollister. I sat in my kitchen and I read the alert 4 times, and each time it stayed the same. Linda. 2 adult children. Long-time employee of the County Roads Department. I want to say I grieved him. I didn't know him well enough to grieve. What I felt was closer to what you feel when a door closes behind you, and you hear the lock click, and you realize it was locked the whole time, and you had been calling it a room. Sunday night's bulletin named a man I did know. His name was Emmett Fry. He ran the hardware store on Commercial Street, the one with the wooden floor that smelled like sawdust and rubber hose. He had sold me a humidifier in January and told me to keep it 3 feet from the wall. The voice said he would die Wednesday morning of a heart attack while opening the store. The gap was 3 days now, down from 5, down from 4. I sat at the board, and I said the word no out loud to no one in a void noise. I did something I'd been refusing to do for 5 nights. I opened my personal email on the station laptop, and I started composing a message to Emmett Fry. I wrote 3 sentences, deleted them. I wrote 2. I deleted those. I wrote Mr. Fry. Please take Wednesday off. Please trust me. Wyatt Keller, KBRN. And I stared at it until the cursor stopped blinking in my head. I didn't send it. Here is the calculation I made, and I'm going to try to be honest about it. If I sent the email and Emmett took Wednesday off and nothing happened, he would call the station. He would call the sheriff. I would be asked questions I could not answer without producing a recording from a system I was not supposed to touch, made by a voice I could not identify, predicting events I had no way to prove I had not arranged. I had already failed to warn Daryl. If I warned Emmett, I would become the person who knew in advance. The person who knew in advance becomes the suspect. That is not paranoia, that is how it works. And worse, what if the warning was the mechanism? What if Emmett, having been told, spent Wednesday morning looking over his shoulder, his blood pressure climbing, his hand shaking on the key in the lock, and the heart attack came because I called it into being? The bulletin hadn't said a stranger killed him. It had said his own heart. Hearts respond to fear. I know that. Everyone knows that. I closed the email without sending. I told myself I was protecting him. I am aware now of what I was actually doing. I stayed at the board until 5. I watched the sun come up through the blinds. I drove home and Corinne was not on her porch and I was relieved, which I noted and filed away as another small evidence of who I was becoming. Monday night, the bulletin named a woman I didn't know, a nursing home resident in Forsyth, scheduled for Tuesday. Tuesday night, the bulletin named a teenage boy, a junior at the high school, scheduled for Thursday. Single car. Rural route. The boy's name was Caleb Henson. I looked him up on the school's website after the shift. Basketball team. Honor roll. 17. The gap was 2 days. I sat at my kitchen table Wednesday morning at 6:14 a.m. and I listened to the police scanner on my phone, and I heard the dispatcher send an ambulance to the hardware store on Commercial Street. I heard a deputy say the words unresponsive male, approximately 60 years old. I heard, later, the confirmation. Emmett Fry, heart, while opening the store. The list on my legal pad was 4 names long, 3 crossed out, 1 pending. I took the pad into the bathroom and I looked at myself in the mirror, and I said out loud, "You could have called him." I said it the way you say a verdict. Then I went and made coffee, because that is what a person who is still pretending to be a person does. I warned Caleb Henson. I want that in the record too. I did one thing right. I drove to the high school Wednesday afternoon. I parked across the street from the student lot and I waited until the last bell, and when a tall kid in a Letterman jacket came out laughing with 2 girls, I recognized him from the team photo on the website, and I got out of my truck. I said, "Are you Caleb Henson?" He said yes, the way a kid says yes to an adult he doesn't know, half polite and half already backing up. I said, "Don't drive tomorrow. Whatever you have planned tomorrow that involves your car, cancel it. Get a ride, stay home, please." He looked at the girls. The girls looked at me. I must have looked like something they had been warned about. I said, "I know how this sounds. I'm not anybody. I work at the radio station. I heard something. Please just don't drive tomorrow." He said, "Okay, man," in the voice you use to end a conversation with a stranger in a parking lot. He walked away. One of the girls glanced back at me with a face I'm still trying to forget, a face that was deciding whether to tell someone about me. I drove home. I sat on the porch in the cold until it got dark. Corinne came out and asked if I wanted soup. I said no. She sat on her side of the railing anyway and said, "Wyatt, "You're scaring me a little." And I said, "I'm scaring me too." And she didn't push. That's the thing about Corinne. She knows when to stop asking. It's part of why I can live next to her. Thursday morning, I woke up before my alarm with a headache that felt like a fist. I turned on the scanner. At 10:17 a.m., a deputy called in a single vehicle rollover on a rural route east of town. Juvenile male, unresponsive at the scene. Transport requested. At 10:44, the call upgraded. The name came over the scanner at 11:09. Caleb Henson, 17. Pronounced. I put the phone face down on the counter and I pressed my palms against the edge of the sink until my hands stopped shaking. He had driven. Of course he had driven. A grown stranger in a parking lot had told him not to, with a face like mine, and he had done exactly what any sensible 17-year-old does. Gone home, told his parents there was some weird guy at the school, and then gotten up the next morning and lived his life. Maybe he had even been careful. Maybe he had driven the long way around. Maybe the warning I gave him had put him on the road he died on. I could not know. That is the thing I am trying to explain. I could not know whether I had caused it, prevented nothing, or made it worse. The bulletin had named him before I ever spoke to him. The bulletin had known. The voice had not been wrong yet. Not once. I called in sick for the Thursday shift. Perry covered it. The station manager, a woman named Diane who has been trying to retire for 6 years, left me a voicemail saying to take as long as I needed, and that she hoped everything was all right at home. I listened to the voicemail twice. The second time I noticed that her voice, in the phone, did not sound quite like her voice in person. Slightly flatter, slightly older. I deleted it. I went back Friday night because I had to know. That's the cleanest way to say it. I went back because the alternative was sitting in my duplex refreshing the scanner feed, and I had learned by then that knowing late was worse than knowing on time. At the board, at least, I was where the voice lived. At home, I was just a man waiting for his phone to buzz. Perry handed off the shift without looking at me. He had heard about Caleb. Everyone had heard about Caleb. In a town this size, a 17-year-old dying is not news. It's a wound that every conversation has to step around for a month. I did the carrier check at midnight. I did it correctly, the way I had been trained, because doing it correctly was the last part of my job that still belonged to the person I had been on Monday before all of this. The bulletin came at 1:02 a.m. It always came at 1:02 now. I had stopped pretending that was a coincidence. The voice said, KBRN News at the top of the hour, Saturday, April 13th. Saturday, tomorrow, one day. Authorities in Taney County have confirmed the death of Corinne Alvey, age 34, an elementary school teacher following an apparent house fire on the east side of Hollister late Friday evening. The cause of the fire is under investigation. Alvey lived alone in one half of a duplex on Poplar Street. Her neighbor, the only other occupant of the structure, was not at home at the time of the fire. I heard the rest of the bulletin the way you hear something when your ears have stopped working correctly. Water in the canal. Pressure. My name was not said, but my absence was. Her neighbor. The only other occupant. Not at home. The bulletin moved on. Weather. A reminder about a city council meeting. The voice, flat and patient, reading Saturday's news on Friday. I took my headphones off and I sat with my hands flat on the board, and I tried to make the room stop tilting. Corinne who brought soup to my porch. Corinne who had asked if I was okay and then not pushed. Corinne who did not deserve to be a line item in a program I was being forced to listen to. The gap was one day, tomorrow, and the voice had told me in its quiet, bureaucratic way that I would not be home. Which meant that whatever I chose to do tomorrow, stay in the duplex, stand on the lawn with a hose, refuse to leave her side. The bulletin already accounted for my absence. The bulletin knew I would be gone. The bulletin was not predicting her death. It was reporting it from the other side of Saturday. back to the Friday I was trapped in. I drove home at 5:30 a.m. I did not go to my side of the duplex. I walked across the shared porch and I knocked on Corinne's door. She opened it in a robe, her hair wet, her face still soft from sleep. She said, "Wyatt, it's barely dawn." I said, "I need you to not be home tonight." She looked at me for a long time. She looked at me the way the girls in the parking lot had looked at me. I saw in her face the exact moment she chose to believe me anyway. She said, "Okay." She went to her sister's in Springfield. She packed a bag in 15 minutes while I stood in her living room and tried not to look at her furniture, which I understood now as things that were about to burn. She asked me once, in the kitchen, "Is someone after me?" And I said, "I don't think it's a person." And she stopped asking. She drove away at 7:02 a.m. I watched her taillights turn at the stop sign, and I stood on the porch in the cold, and I realized I had done what I had refused to do for Daryl and Emmett and Caleb. I had warned her. I had used the one piece of information I had, and I had spent it on the person whose wall touched mine. I want to be honest about that. I did not save her because she was the most deserving. I saved her because she was the closest. I have thought about that a great deal since. I went inside my half of the duplex and I tried to sleep and I could not. At noon I walked the property. I checked the breaker box, I checked the water heater, I checked the dryer vent on her side through the back porch because I had read somewhere that dryer vents cause fires. I unplugged her coffee maker through the window. I did every small thing a person does when they are trying to negotiate with a future that has already been printed. At 3 p.m. I called the non-emergency line at the sheriff's office. I said I had a concern about a possible fire hazard at my duplex, and could they send someone to look. The deputy who arrived was young and tired and professional. He walked through both units. He found nothing. He told me kindly that if I was worried I should consider a smoke alarm upgrade, and he left. At 6 p.m. I sat on my porch with a fire extinguisher on one side and a garden hose uncoiled on the other, and I waited. At 9:47 p.m. the fire started in Corinne's kitchen. I was sitting 10 feet from her door. I heard something pop inside the wall. Not a crash. A small domestic sound, like a light bulb giving up. Then I smelled it. Then I saw the orange light bloom behind her kitchen curtain. I hit the door with my shoulder. It gave on the second try. The kitchen was already involved. The cabinet above the stove, the curtain, the ceiling. I used the extinguisher. I used the hose through the window. I called 911 before I did either, which is the only thing I did in the correct order. The volunteer fire department got there in 9 minutes. They saved the structure. They saved most of her things. They did not save the kitchen, and they did not save a long, scorched streak up the hallway wall. The fire chief, a man named Bo Hendren, told me later that the cause looked electrical. Old wiring in the wall behind the stove. He said, "Lucky you were home, Wyatt. She lives alone, right? This could have been bad." I said yes. He said, "Where is she tonight?" I said, "Her sister's." He looked at me for a second longer than the conversation required. Then he nodded and went back to his truck. I sat on the porch, wet, smelling like smoke, and I understood that I had done something the bulletin did not account for. I had been home. The bulletin had said I wasn't. The bulletin had been wrong for the first time, which should have felt like victory. It did not. It felt like I had been given a note, and the note said, in handwriting I was beginning to recognize, "You are not a listener anymore. You are a variable." Corinne came back Sunday morning. She stood in the doorway of her scorched kitchen and she did not cry. She said, "Thank you, Wyatt." And then she said, "What did you hear?" I told her. Not all of it. I told her I had heard her name on the air out of sequence before any of it had happened. I told her about Daryl and Emmett and Caleb. I told her about the bulletins at 1:02 a.m. and the narrowing gap, and the voice that was not mine but came out of my station's own carrier. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she said, "Why didn't you warn the boy?" I said, "I did." She said, "Why didn't you warn him better?" I didn't answer that. She made coffee in my kitchen, because hers was a crime scene of a sort, and we sat at my table, and after a long silence she said, "You have to stop going in." I said, "If I stop going in, I won't know." She said, "That's the point, Wyatt." I looked at her across the table. Her eyes were red from smoke, not crying. I thought about what it would mean to walk away from the board, to quit the shift, to let Perry or Leland sit in that chair at 1:02 a.m. and hear what I was supposed to hear, and to not know. I thought about whether the bulletins would keep coming if I wasn't there. I thought about whether they were for me specifically, or for whoever sat in that seat, or for whatever piece of equipment in that room had become a receiver. I thought, for the first time, that I did not know where the voice was coming from. I had assumed it was coming from the future. That was an assumption. I had not checked. I said to Corinne, "I need one more night." She said, "No, you don't." I went anyway. Sunday night I got to the station at 11 and I did not sit at the board. I went into the transmitter room. The transmitter at KBRN is a Continental from the late 80s, a beige cabinet the size of a refrigerator, full of tubes and relays and a smell like warm dust. I know this machine. I have replaced its filters with my own hands. I have talked to it, the way engineers talk to old equipment when no one's watching. I pulled the service panel and I traced every input, program feed from the studio, remote control line, carrier sample loop. Nothing was patched in that shouldn't have been. Nothing was bleeding in from outside. The transmitter was doing exactly what it had been doing for 30 years, which was converting whatever audio we fed it into a signal at 1,290 kilohertz and pushing it out the tower, which meant the voice was coming from inside the building. I went back to the studio. I looked at the board. I looked at the automation rack. I looked at the logger. The logger is where the bulletins lived, time-stamped, recorded. But the logger records the output. Something had to be producing the audio before the logger caught it. I sat down at the automation computer. I opened the program log for the overnight block. It was the syndicated feed, as expected, scheduled second by second, no local inserts, no breaks I hadn't programmed myself. Except, at 1:02 a.m., every night for the last 6 nights, there was a 1-minute 40-second break in the log that said, in the operator field, WK, local insert, WK, my initials, scheduled by me, apparently, from this terminal, at timestamps that corresponded to the afternoons before each bulletin aired. I had not scheduled them. I knew I had not scheduled them. I work the overnight. I am not at the station in the afternoon. I am asleep in the afternoon. I clicked on the first entry. The source audio was a file in the local insert folder. I opened the folder. There were 7 files. 6 of them had already aired. The 7th was labeled Monday, April 15th. Tomorrow. I did not play it. I stood up from the terminal and I walked out of the studio and I stood in the hallway with my hands on my knees and I breathed in a way that did not feel like breathing. Someone with my credentials had scheduled these bulletins. Someone with my credentials had produced them, had recorded the voice, had saved the files to my station's automation system in my name in advance on afternoons when I was not here. Or, and this is the version I did not want, someone whose credentials were mine had. I went back to the terminal. I opened the user log. Login history. For each of the 6 afternoons on which a bulletin had been scheduled, there was a login to the automation system at around 3 p.m. under my username from the studio terminal on the studio network. Duration around 40 minutes, log out clean. I do not come to the station in the afternoon. I have not come to the station in the afternoon in 3 years. I sleep in the afternoon. I sleep with my phone on silent and my curtains pulled. I looked at my hands on the keyboard. They did not look unfamiliar. They looked like the hands of a man who had, apparently, been doing something he had no memory of doing. I played the Monday, April 15th file. The voice came out of the studio monitor, flat, older, patient. It said KBRN News at the top of the hour. Monday, April 15th. KBRN overnight engineer Wyatt Keller, age 33, was found deceased at the station early Monday morning. Keller had been the overnight engineer at the station for the past 4 years. Cause of death is pending investigation. The station will continue regular programming. Then weather. Then a note about the library hours. I listened to the whole thing standing up, with my hand braced on the back of the chair. When it ended, I played it again. It was my voice. Flattened, aged, stripped of the small tics that make my voice mine. But mine. Read in my cadence, with my little hesitation between overnight and engineer, which I do every time I say the phrase out loud because the two words compete for the same syllable. A thing I had never noticed about myself until I heard it done back to me in a recording I had not made. I sat down in the chair. The voice had been mine the whole time. All 6 bulletins. Daryl, Patricia, Emmett, the nursing home woman, Caleb, Corinne. My voice aged and hollowed reading obituaries I had not written, scheduled by me in hours I had not been awake. Which meant the broadcast was not coming from 6 days in the future. Or, it was, but not from a future separate from me. It was coming from me, 6 days ahead. From some version of me who sat down at this terminal in the afternoons, in a state I had no access to, and recorded the coming week. I understood then why I had not warned Daryl, why I had hesitated on Emmett, why I had warned Caleb so badly that it barely counted. Some part of me had already decided what the list would be, in advance, in a voice I would not recognize as mine until the last name. The last name was mine. The Monday, April 15th file was today plus 1 day. The gap had closed to almost 0. The bulletin had caught up with the present. Tomorrow morning the overnight engineer would be found dead at the station, and the file that announced it was sitting in a folder I was logged into. I thought about Corinne. I thought about the version of her that had been in the first draft of this week, the version who died in her kitchen while I was not home. I had pulled her out of the program. I had proven the program could be edited. I had been, for one night, a variable and not a listener. I could do it again. I opened the Monday, April 15th file in the audio editor. I did not know what I was going to do. Delete it, overwrite it, record something else in its place. Prove, one more time, that the voice on the tape could be wrong. The file opened. The waveform filled the screen. I saw the shape of my own recorded breath between sentences. I saw the tiny pause where I hesitated between overnight and engineer. I put my hand on the mouse. I hovered over the delete key. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost kind, that if I deleted the file, I would have to record a replacement. The automation required an audio file in the slot. The 1:02 a.m. break was scheduled. It could not air dead air or the syndicator would flag it. Something had to play, which meant whatever I put in that slot I would be recording it. In my voice, into this microphone, at this terminal, which meant I was about to become the voice on the tape. I took my hand off the mouse. I sat back in the chair, and I understood that I had not been the listener all week. The listener had been the version of me who woke up every night at midnight, put on headphones, and heard a voice he thought was a stranger's. The voice had been the other version, the afternoon one, the one who logged in under my name and read the coming week into a microphone and went home and slept until the overnight version took the chair. They had been handing the chair back and forth. One of me made the broadcast, one of me received it. The receiving one got to feel horrified, the recording one got to do the work. And tonight, For the first time, I was both. I didn't delete the file. I listened to it one more time, start to finish, at full volume in the studio with the monitors up. I let my own aged voice tell me I had died on Monday, April 15th, 'cause pending station will continue regular programming. I let it tell me that even the radio station, the one institution that required me, would not pause for me. The sentence, "the station will continue regular programming," was the kindest thing anyone had said to me all week. It meant the voice, whoever it was, still thought of the station as a thing that continued. It meant something was going to keep broadcasting after me. I thought about Corinne's face in my kitchen. "You have to stop going in." I thought about Caleb in the parking lot. "Okay, man." I thought about Daryl, who I had not called, who I could have called, who I had decided before I decided anything else that week was not worth the risk to my job. I understood sitting there that the afternoon version of me had not been a stranger. He had been the part of me that already knew what I would choose. He had been recording my decisions, not predicting them. The broadcast was not a warning, it was a log. At 1:02 a.m., I let the Monday, April 15th file play on the air. I sat in the chair and I listened to my own voice tell the town I was going to die in the morning. I watched the logger record it. I watched the timestamp stamp. I did not edit it. I did not pull it. I let the broadcast run its schedule uninterrupted, the way I had let it run for 6 nights before tonight, the way I had not interrupted it for Daryl or Emmett or the woman in Forsyth or the boy in the parking lot. When it ended, the syndicated feed came back. A caller in Arizona was explaining the history of the interstate system. His voice was calm and full of wrong information, and it felt, for a moment, like the most comforting thing in the world. I did not die. I sat in the chair until 5 a.m. I did the carrier readings. I logged the night. I drove home. The bulletin had aired. The bulletin had been wrong. Or the bulletin had been a draft. The afternoon version of me had recorded what he assumed would happen, and I, the overnight version, had chosen differently by not choosing at all, by not recording over it, by letting the voice speak and then standing up and walking out. I understood driving home in the grey light that I had done the thing Corinne told me to do, only backwards. I had not stopped going in. I had gone in and refused to act, which it turned out was the only act that had ever been available to me. I didn't quit. I thought I would. I thought, driving home Monday morning, that I would call Diane at a decent hour and tell her I needed to step down from overnights, that Perry could take them, that Leland could take them, that anyone who was not me could sit in that chair at 1:02 a.m. and let whatever wanted to broadcast. I did not call her. I slept until 2 in the afternoon. When I woke up, I went to the kitchen and made coffee, and I stood at the window and I waited to feel the thing I had been afraid of all week. The pull, the blackout, the afternoon version of me rising up and driving to the station and logging in under my name and recording next week's list. Nothing came. I drank the coffee. I watched a squirrel on the power line. My hands were my hands. My voice, when I tested it against the refrigerator's hum by humming back, was mine in the way a voice is when no one is listening. At 3 p.m., the hour the login history said he arrived, I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and I waited. Nothing came. At 3:45 p.m. I got up off the floor. I ate a sandwich. I called Corinne, who was at her sister's still, and I told her I was okay. I told her the fire had been, as far as I could tell, the last entry in a list that was closed now. She did not entirely believe me. She said she would come back at the end of the week. She said, "Wyatt, if you hear it again, you leave. Promise me." I said, "I promise." I meant it in the way you mean a promise you have already negotiated against in your head. That night I went in for the shift. Perry handed off the board with a look that said he had heard from Diane, who had heard from somebody, that something was going on with me. He did not ask. Perry has been married 41 years. He understands when not to ask. I did the carrier check at midnight, clean. At 1:02 a.m., the syndicated feed cut for the local insert slot. The automation pulled a file from the folder. I had checked the folder before the shift. There was no file scheduled for tonight. The slot was empty. The empty slot played. Dead air. 7 seconds of nothing on the monitor, which is a long time on the radio but survivable. Then the syndicated feed came back. A caller in Oregon about ley lines. The night continued. No bulletin. No voice. No name. I sat at the board and I did not feel relief. I felt the opposite of relief. I felt the specific, cold attention of a thing that was not currently speaking. The next afternoon I went to the station at 3 p.m. I had to see. I used my key. I walked through the front office past the framed photograph of the original 1952 broadcast team. I went down the hall to the studio. The door was unlocked. I do not leave the studio door unlocked. I am the overnight engineer. Locking the studio is the last thing I do before I leave. I went in. The automation terminal was on. Logged in. Under my username. The microphone in the recording booth was warm, the way a microphone is warm for about 10 minutes after it's been used. The local insert folder had one new file in it. Tuesday, April 23rd. A week out. The gap was 6 days again. We were starting over. I stood in the studio in the afternoon light, and I understood finally what had happened and what was going to keep happening. The afternoon version of me had not stopped. He had just, for one day, skipped, either to let me breathe or to let me believe I was free, or because the list had required a pause after my own name was crossed off unrecorded. I did not know which. I was not going to know. I did not play the file. I did not delete it either. I closed the folder. I logged out. I locked the studio. I left. That night at the overnight shift, at 1:02 a.m., the automation pulled the Tuesday, April 23rd file and played it. I did not take the headphones off. I listened. The voice was mine, flat and aged, reading a name I did not recognize, from a town 20 miles away, dead in a way the voice described, with the same quiet, bureaucratic patience it had used for Darryl. I did not write the name down. I did not look it up. I did not drive to the address. I did not email anyone. I finished the shift. I logged the carrier readings. I drove home. This is the arrangement I have now. The afternoon version of me records the week. The overnight version of me airs it. Somewhere in the hours between, I live a life that looks from the outside like a life. I pay my rent. I eat sandwiches. I wave at Corinne, who came back, who sleeps lightly, who has installed a fire alarm the size of a dinner plate and keeps her car keys on the nightstand. I do not warn anyone anymore. I want to be careful about how I say that. I do not warn anyone because the one time I tried in a parking lot with a 17-year-old, I could not tell afterwards whether I had pulled him out of the list or pushed him further in. And because the other time I tried, with Corinne, I proved only that editing one line does not cancel the program. The program keeps running. The slot at 1:02 a.m. keeps being filled. The voice keeps being mine. I have thought about leaving. I have thought about driving to Tulsa and staying with my sister and letting the station hire someone else for the overnight. I have thought about what happens to the list then. Whether the afternoon version of me follows me to Tulsa, whether he can only exist inside that studio, in that chair, with that microphone warm from a session I don't remember sitting through. Whether, if I leave, the 1:02 a.m. slot goes silent and the names stop, or whether they just get read by a different mouth in a different town, and I will have traded knowing for not knowing and called it peace. I have not left. I sit the shift. I do the carrier check. I air the bulletin. I listen to my own voice tell me who is next. And I do not write the name down. And I go home and I sleep. And somewhere inside that sleep, a version of me gets up and goes to the studio in the afternoon and reads the coming week into a microphone, and I do not remember any of it. And the logger remembers everything. I am still on the air. That is the sentence I keep coming back to. Not alive. On the air. The station continues regular programming. It was the kindest thing the voice ever said to me, and it turns out it was a promise. Corinne asked me the other night whether I was afraid. I told her the truth, which is that fear was a thing I could afford in the first week, when the voice was a stranger. Now that the voice is mine, fear is not the right word. What I feel, sitting at the board at 1:02 a.m., is closer to custody. I am holding something that belongs to me and to someone who is also me and who has already decided things I have not yet caught up to. Every night at the board is rehearsal. I know that now. Not rehearsal for my death, which the bulletin got wrong, or got right in a way I haven't reached. Rehearsal for becoming the one who records. Rehearsal for the afternoon. Every hesitation I make at the microphone, every breath I take between words. The other version of me is listening and learning my cadence and getting better at it. One night, the voice on the tape will be indistinguishable from the voice in the chair. One night, I will sit down at 1:02 a.m. and the bulletin will play, and I will not be able to tell whether I am hearing it or saying it. Until then, I keep the shift. I log the carrier. I do not write the names down. The signal is clean. The tower is blinking. The station continues regular programming.